Angel on the Battlefield. The Story of Clara Barton. Chapter 1. A Christmas Gift of Destiny. On Christmas Day, 1821, when the first snow blanketed the hills of New England in pristine white, a girl was born in the small town of Oxford, Massachusetts, who would become an angel to thousands of dying men. They named her Clarissa Harlowe Barton after the heroine of Richardson's novel, but everyone called her simply Clara. She was the youngest of 5 children in the family of Captain Stephen Barton, a stern but fair man who served in the local militia and was respected throughout the region. Her mother, Sarah Barton, was a strong and practical woman, with hands that could bake bread, bandage wounds, and comfort a crying child. The Barton house stood on a hill, surrounded by apple orchards and fields where wheat rippled in summer. Winter evenings were spent by the large fireplace where oak logs crackled. Father would read newspapers aloud, sharing news from across the country. Mother would mend or knit, and the older children would play checkers or read books. Clara grew up as a painfully shy girl. In public, she would blush to the roots of her hair and hide behind her mother's skirt. When guests came to the house, little Clara would run to the barn and sit there, petting the cat or talking to the horses. Animals didn't frighten her. On the contrary, she felt calm and confident with them. Even then, there was a strange seriousness in her dark eyes, as if she could see things others couldn't notice. While neighborhood children played with dolls or tag, little Clara would bandage the paws of wounded baby birds that had fallen from their nests or nurse abandoned kittens. "This girl sees others' pain," said their neighbor Mrs. Wilson, watching 7-year-old Clara carefully bandage a bird's paw with a clean cloth. "She has a special gift." Her parents were concerned about their daughter's shyness and even consulted the famous phrenologist Lorenzo Fowler, who came to their region to study people's character by the shape of their skulls. After examining little Clara, feeling her head with his long fingers, he gave unexpected advice. "This girl should become a teacher. She has a natural gift for understanding people and helping them. Working with children will help her overcome her shyness and find her true calling." Prophetic words. But before Clara would become a teacher, fate had prepared her first serious lesson in mercy, a lesson that would define her entire future life. When Clara turned 11 on a hot summer day in 1832, something happened that would change her forever. Her older brother David, who was 20, climbed onto the barn roof to fix some shingles torn loose by the wind. The board under his feet was rotten, gave way, and he fell from a great height, sustaining severe head injuries. Dr. Daniel Moore, the family physician, examined David and shook his gray head. "The injury is very serious. He may not regain consciousness, and if he does—" The doctor didn't finish, but everyone understood the consequences could be irreversible. The parents and older brothers were at a loss. What to do? How to care for such a severely injured patient? But little Clara didn't lose her composure. She simply sat by David's bedside and took his large hand in her small palms. "I'll take care of him," she said calmly, looking at her parents with her serious dark eyes. "He'll get better, I know he will." And so began a 2-year vigil that became Clara's real school of mercy. She practically never left her brother's bedside, sleeping on a chair next to his bed. She fed him with a spoon when he could swallow, read aloud his favorite books, adventure novels and travel stories, changed the bandages on his head, made sure he took his medicine. Clara learned to apply leeches, a popular treatment at the time, and did it so skillfully and carefully that even experienced Dr. Moore was amazed at her technique. "This girl truly has golden hands," he told her parents, watching how patiently and tenderly Clara cared for her brother. And rare patience. She intuitively understands what a sick person needs. Clara talked to David even when he lay unconscious. She told him news from town, read letters from friends who asked about his health, sang songs he had loved as a child. Her soft voice was the only one he responded to during rare moments of clarity. On winter evenings, when the wind howled outside and snow covered the paths while the house was warm from the large stove, Clara would sit beside her brother by the light of a kerosene lamp. She would knit warm socks for him or read quietly to herself, but always listened to his breathing, ready to help at any moment. Sometimes her mother would check on her. "Clara dear, come have dinner with the family. I'll sit with David." "No, Mama," the girl would reply, without looking up from her book. "He's used to me being here. If I leave, he'll sense it and get upset. Just bring me something here." And indeed, whenever Clara left, even for an hour, David would start thrashing in delirium and calling for her. It was as if there was an invisible thread between them that couldn't be broken. After 2 years of patient and selfless care, what everyone called a miracle happened. David completely recovered. He not only regained consciousness, but restored all his functions. No consequences from the trauma remained. Doctors were baffled. Such severe head injuries rarely ended so successfully. "This is your doing, little Clara," David told his sister when he could sit in a chair by the window and look out at the spring garden. "You literally brought me back to life. I remember your voice even in the darkest days when I understood nothing." But Clara herself saw what happened as perfectly natural. How could one act otherwise when a loved one was suffering? Wasn't it natural to give all one's strength to help someone in trouble? The experience of caring for David transformed the shy girl. Clara understood. When someone needs help, fear and uncertainty retreat. Clarity of purpose and calm confidence in one's abilities emerge. This knowledge would become her support in the future. Chapter 2. The Teacher's Path. At 18, Clara Barton became a teacher in a small rural school near her family home. For a young woman in the mid-19th century, this was one of the few opportunities to gain independence and respect in society. The salary was modest, just a few dollars a month, but Clara felt this was her true calling. The first school was housed in a simple wooden building with one classroom, where children aged 6 to 16 sat at roughly built desks. In winter, the school was cold despite the cast iron stove in the corner. In summer, it became stuffy and dusty, and Clara would open all the windows to freshen the air even a little. Clara proved to be a born educator. Children, sensing her sincere care and understanding, were drawn to the young teacher like flowers to the sun. She was demanding but fair. Unlike many teachers of that time, Clara never yelled at children or hit their hands with a ruler for the slightest offense. "You know, children," she would say, leaning over a desk to a small boy who couldn't master reading. "Each of you is special. Everyone has their own talent, their own strength. We just need to find it and help it flourish." She was especially good at working with difficult children, those other teachers considered hopeless and ready to expel from school. Tommy Harris, son of the local drunk, constantly fought with classmates and disrupted lessons. His rough outbursts made other children fear him and teachers angry. But Clara saw in the aggressive 12-year-old boy not a malicious bully, but a deeply unhappy child, full of pain and loneliness. She noticed how he flinched when someone raised their voice, how his eyes filled with tears he desperately tried to hide. Clara would keep Tommy after class, not for punishment, but to talk. She would treat him to an apple from her lunch, ask how things were at home, and learned that his father regularly beat both the boy and his mother. "Tommy," she said one day, placing her hand on his shoulder, "school is your home too. No one will hurt you here. And if things get difficult or painful, come to me, always, any time." The boy burst into tears. For the first time in a long while, someone had shown him genuine kindness without ulterior motives. From that day, Tommy seemed reborn, becoming one of the best and most obedient students. Years later, he would become a successful farmer and remember all his life the teacher who believed in him when no one else did. Clara taught in various Massachusetts schools for several years, gradually gaining experience and earning a reputation as one of the best teachers in the region. But the ambitious and intelligent young woman dreamed of more than just teaching in a country school. In 1850, when she turned 29, Clara went to study at the Liberal Institute in Clinton, New York. This was a progressive educational institution where men and women received education together, an unprecedented practice for that time that shocked conservatives across the country. At the institute, Clara eagerly studied mathematics, natural sciences, French, philosophy, and literature. She was one of the best students and for the first time in her life felt intellectually equal to men. Here she became acquainted with progressive ideas of women's rights that were just emerging in America, but family circumstances forced her to return home earlier than planned. However, the knowledge gained was not wasted. It made Clara even more confident and ambitious. In 1852, 30-year-old Clara moved to Bordentown, New Jersey. This industrial town was known for its textile factories and mills, but education there was poorly managed. Workers' children either didn't attend school at all or went to private schools their families could barely afford. Learning of this outrageous situation, Clara approached the town council members with a bold proposal that stunned these respectable gentlemen. "Allow me to create a free public school for all children in the town, regardless of their parents' income. I'm prepared to work the first year completely free, just to prove to you and all residents that this is possible and necessary." The town authorities exchanged glances of disbelief and even some irritation. What could one woman accomplish, especially an outsider? But Clara was persistent, and eventually they allowed her to try, just to be rid of the problem. She started with 6 students in a tiny room above a hardware store. Clara personally bought chalk, paper, textbooks, and ink, spending her meager savings. But news of the free school, where children were not only taught literacy, but also fed hot breakfast, quickly spread throughout Bordentown. Within a month, she had 20 students. Within 6 months, 100. Clara worked from morning until late at night. She was simultaneously teacher, principal, custodian, and cook. In the evenings, she walked through working-class neighborhoods, convincing parents to send their children to school. "Mrs. O'Connor," she would say to an Irish woman with 7 children, "your Mary is a very capable girl. She has a sharp mind and a kind heart. She could become a teacher or even a doctor if she gets a good education." "Oh, Miss Barton," the tired woman would sigh, holding her baby to her chest. "What education when there's so much work and worry at home? The girl needs to help the family earn bread." "Listen to me," Clara would take the woman's work-worn hands. "Education is the only thing that can break the vicious cycle of poverty. Your children deserve a better life than this. Give them a chance. and often she managed to convince even the most stubborn parents. By the end of the first year, Clara's school had 200 students. The results were simply impressive. Children from the poorest working families showed such progress in reading, writing, and arithmetic that even the most vicious skeptics had to acknowledge the effectiveness of her methods. The city authorities, seeing the incredible success, decided to build a new spacious building and officially recognized the school as municipal. By 1853, it had 600 students, one of the largest schools in all of New Jersey. But it was then that an event occurred that would radically change Clara's life and show her the blatant injustice women faced in a man's world. The school board, consisting exclusively of men, decreed that the director of such a large and important school should be a member of the stronger sex. Clara was graciously kept as assistant principal, but with a salary exactly half that of her new boss, a man who had never worked with children and knew nothing about pedagogy. "This is outrageous and unfair," fumed Clara's friend, Fanny Childs. "You created this school from absolute nothing. How dare they treat you this way?" But Clara was calm, though inside she burned with indignation. "Fanny, I will never work for less money than a man doing exactly the same job. If they think a woman can't manage a school she created and developed herself, then they can do without me." And she resigned, despite pleas from friends, colleagues, and students' parents. This brave act shocked not only Bordentown, but the entire region. In those days, women rarely dared such open protests against discrimination. Saying goodbye to the children, Clara could barely hold back tears. "Remember, my dear ones, education is your road to freedom. Study, read, think independently. And never let anyone tell you that you can't do something because of who you are, boy or girl, rich or poor." The children cried, not wanting to part with their beloved teacher. Parents organized a petition demanding her return, collecting over 300 signatures. But Clara was adamant she had already decided to radically change her life. In 1854, 33-year-old Clara Barton came to Washington, a city of ambitions, political intrigue, and opportunities unprecedented for a provincial girl. The capital greeted her with the noise of carriages on cobblestone streets, vendors' cries, and the smell of river water from the Potomac. Thanks to letters of recommendation from influential friends in Massachusetts, Clara got a job at the patent office, becoming one of the first women to work in the federal government. This was truly revolutionary for that time. The work proved fascinating and diverse. Clara studied applications for the most incredible inventions, from new plow designs to mysterious mechanisms, whose purpose took long to guess. She compiled detailed reports, maintained extensive correspondence with inventors across the country, and organized document flow. And most importantly, she earned $1,400 a year, exactly the same as men in similar positions. For a woman in the mid-19th century, this was simply fantastic money and unprecedented independence. Chapter 3. The Turning Point. Clara rented a cozy apartment on Pennsylvania Avenue, furnished it with books, paintings, and comfortable furniture. For the first time in her life, she was truly free and independent. In the evenings, she attended theaters and concerts, socialized with the capital's intellectual elite, and made useful connections. It seemed life had finally found stability and predictability. But the political winds in the country were changing. In 1856, an administration came to power that was sharply opposed to women's participation in government affairs. The new Secretary of the Interior, Robert McClelland, a fierce opponent of women's rights, first demoted Clara. From a qualified clerk, she became an ordinary copyist with exactly half her previous salary. "A woman should not earn as much as a man," he declared openly at one meeting. "It's unnatural and harmful to public morals." Clara gritted her teeth and continued working, hoping this was a temporary measure. But in 1857, under the Buchanan administration, she was dismissed entirely. For 3 long years, she scraped by with odd jobs, giving private lessons to wealthy children, translating documents from French, writing articles for ladies' magazines. These were hard times when she had to economize on everything. Salvation came with Abraham Lincoln's election as president in 1860. The new, more liberal administration returned Clara to the patent office. She was already 39 by the standards of that time, a respectable age when unmarried women usually resigned themselves to the quiet life of old maids and the role of dependents in relatives' families. But fate had prepared a completely different destiny for Clara. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, Confederates opened artillery fire on the federal Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. For 34 hours, fierce bombardment continued. When the smoke cleared, the United States flag no longer flew over the fort. The Civil War had begun, the bloodiest and most destructive conflict in American history, which would claim the lives of more than 620,000 people. On April 19, 1861, exactly a week after hostilities began, a train arrived in Washington with the first wounded soldiers after the bloody clash in Baltimore. Clara came to the station to meet the fighters of the 6th Massachusetts Regiment. These were boys from her home state, some of whom she remembered as children. But instead of neat rows of brave soldiers in brand new uniforms, she saw a scene that shook her to her very core and forever changed the course of her life. On dirty, blood-soaked stretchers lay mutilated, exhausted men. Their uniforms were torn to shreds. Many soldiers were practically naked. They lacked even the most basic things: a clean shirt, a piece of soap, a handkerchief. The smell of blood, sweat, and human suffering hung in the air around the station. Among the wounded, Clara recognized young Ned Larkins, the 17-year-old son of her neighbors from Oxford. A bullet had pierced his shoulder, and the wound was healing poorly, becoming infected. "Miss Barton," he whispered, seeing a familiar face, and his eyes filled with tears of relief. "How good to see a familiar face. Tell Mama I wasn't a coward, that I fought bravely." "Ned, dear, what are you saying?" Clara knelt beside the stretcher and took his good hand in hers. "Of course you fought bravely, but now the main thing is to get well. We'll heal you and you'll go home healthy to your mama." "I miss home so much, Miss Barton," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. "Mama's apple pies, the smell of hay in the loft, our cat, Mirka's purring." That night, Clara didn't sleep a wink. She walked around her apartment, stopped at the window, looking at the flickering lights of the Capitol. The same thoughts kept spinning in her head. What can I do? How can I help these boys? They're someone's sons, brothers, husbands. By morning, the decision had formed completely and irrevocably. Clara sat at her writing desk and began to write. Letters to newspapers in her home state, appeals to women's charitable societies in Massachusetts, pleas to old friends and acquaintances. The essence of all the letters was simple and clear. Soldiers needed help, and they needed it immediately. "Dear fellow citizens," she wrote to the editor of the Worcester Spy newspaper. "Our boys are dying not only from enemy bullets, but from lack of basic care and attention. They have no clean underwear, warm blankets, or medicine for pain. We, the women of Massachusetts, can and must change this. Every jar of homemade jam, every roll of bandages, every warm scarf can save someone's precious life. The response exceeded all expectations. Within a week, Clara's apartment had turned into a real warehouse of humanitarian aid. Packages arrived daily. Women sent everything they could: homemade preserves and pickles, warm clothing, medicines, bandages, letters with kind wishes to unknown soldiers. Mrs. Elizabeth Harris from Salem sent a huge box of bandages with a touching note. "I lost my only son at Lexington during the War of Independence. May these bandages save someone's boy and spare some mother the grief I experienced." Clara personally delivered all these supplies to improvised hospitals, hastily organized in government buildings, churches, and private homes. She saw how soldiers' faces literally lit up when she brought them homemade cookies or warm socks, knitted by caring hands of unknown women. Miss Barton, a young army surgeon, Dr. James Dunn, told her once, "You do more for the morale of our wounded than any general or politician. You give them hope." But the more Clara worked with the wounded in rear hospitals, the clearer she understood. Help here was certainly needed, but the real need was where cannons roared, where men fell and bled on the battlefield. The soldiers' stories revealed a terrible truth. The Army's medical services were organized terribly. The wounded often lay on the battlefield for many hours waiting for help. Many died not from the wounds themselves, but from thirst, cold, and lack of basic care. "I must be there," Clara thought, studying the map of military operations she had hung on her apartment wall. "There where boys fall and call for their mothers in agony. There where I can help in the first, most critically important minutes." This was a completely insane idea. A woman on the battlefield? Unheard of! But the more Clara thought about it, the stronger her resolve became. In the summer of 1862, she began persistently seeking official permission to work directly in the combat zone. This required long months of negotiations, countless letters, meetings with influential people. Many considered her idea not just absurd, but improper. Clara, her old friend, Senator Henry Wilson, told her, "The battlefield is no place for a decent woman. It's real hell on earth." "That's exactly why angels are so needed there, Senator," she replied calmly. Finally, in August 1862, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, impressed by her persistence and results of her work in the rear, gave her official permission. A 40-year-old woman who had never seen a real battle received a pass to the very front lines of war. Clara bought a sturdy wagon, loaded it with medical supplies, bandages, morphine, chloroform, surgical instruments, took several young volunteers as helpers, and set off for where America's fate was being decided. She didn't yet know that this bold step would forever inscribe her name in history, that in a few months, Union Army soldiers would call her the Angel of the Battlefield, that dying men would whisper her name, asking her to stay beside them in their final moments. Chapter 4. Angel on the Battlefield dawned on September 17, 1862, in the vicinity of the small town of Antietam, Maryland, was misty and deceptively quiet. Clara woke up in her wagon, where she had spent a short night, and the first thing she heard was the melodious singing of birds in roadside trees. A light breeze stirred the leaves, the air was fresh and clean. Nothing foretold that in a few hours this peaceful corner of America would witness the bloodiest day in the country's history. Antietam, a name that would forever enter the annals of history as the site of the greatest slaughter, where more Americans would fall in one day than in all previous wars combined. Clara was nervous but determined. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked her supplies one last time. Bundles of bandages, bottles of morphine, vials of chloroform for operations, canned goods for weakened wounded, flasks of clean water. Her assistants, 2 young volunteers from Massachusetts, were pale with excitement and fear. "Miss Barton," asked one of them, 19-year-old Tommy Wilson, whose voice was shaking, "aren't you afraid?" Clara looked at him, so young, with down on his cheeks instead of a real beard. She remembered her brother David when she cared for him after his fall, just as young and vulnerable. "Of course I'm afraid, Tommy, but you know what I've learned in my life? When someone is really hurt and scared, your own fear takes a back seat. Only the desire to help remains." At 5:30 in the morning, the first artillery shot shattered the morning silence. Then another, and suddenly the whole world around exploded with the deafening roar of cannonade. The Battle of Antietam had begun. Clara directed her wagon straight to the center of the fighting. What opened before her eyes exceeded the most terrible nightmares. A beautiful cornfield had turned into a bloody mess of broken stalks, mud, and human bodies. The air was thick with smoke from rifle volleys and explosions, screams of the wounded, and the whistle of bullets. She stopped the wagon behind a small hill that provided some shelter from direct fire and immediately got to work. The first wounded man brought to her by medics was a very young soldier from New York. A bullet had pierced his chest, and he was coughing up blood, trying to breathe. "Mama," he whispered, looking at Clara with eyes glazed with pain. "Mama, it hurts. I want to go home." Clara knelt beside him right in the mud, ignoring the blood that immediately soaked her dark dress. She took his cold hand in her warm palms and looked into his eyes. "Hush, dear, I'm here, I'm with you. What's your name?" Johnny McGuire," he said with difficulty. "I'm only 18. Clara immediately understood the wound was fatal. She had seen enough deaths caring for the sick. But her face remained calm and kind. She took a clean white handkerchief from her bag and carefully wiped the blood from his lips. "Johnny, you're a very brave soldier. Your mama would be proud of you. You fought for the right cause." "Will you tell her? Tell her I wasn't a coward?" the boy barely whispered. "That I thought of her until the very end?" "I'll definitely tell her, Johnny. Definitely." The young man died in a few minutes, squeezing her hand. Clara carefully closed his eyes, made the sign of the cross, and immediately moved to the next wounded soldier. Tears flowed down her cheeks, mixing with the dust and smoke of battle, but her hands remained steady and sure. All that terrible day, she worked under constant fire. Bullets whistled around her like angry bees. Shell fragments flew in all directions. One bullet passed through her dress sleeve, leaving a neat hole but miraculously not hitting her arm. Another bullet knocked a cup of water from her hands just as she was giving drink to a soldier, exhausted by thirst. "Miss, you need to get away from here immediately," a young lieutenant shouted to her as he ran past. "It's too dangerous for a woman here." But Clara didn't even lift her head, continuing to tightly bandage a soldier's wound. "Lieutenant, if it's dangerous for me here, it's dangerous for these boys too, and they can't move on their own." By noon, her dark dress was soaked through with blood, others and her own. Her face was blackened with gunpowder smoke, her hair disheveled and escaped from under her hat. She looked like a fury of war, but in every movement, every touch to the wounded, there was maternal tenderness. Clara worked with amazing methodicalness. First, she stopped the bleeding using everything at hand: bandages, pieces of her dress if nothing else remained. Then she gave water to those who could drink. then morphine to ease the pain. With the hopelessly wounded, she simply sat beside them, held their hands, spoke quiet words of comfort. "You're a real angel," one of the wounded whispered to her. A sergeant about 30 with a shot-off leg. "I thought I would die here alone, like a dog on the road. But here, I see such a kind face." "No one should die alone," Clara replied softly, adjusting his improvised pillow made from a folded coat. "No one." At the height of the battle, when the thunder of cannonade was especially deafening, they brought a Union Army officer to her improvised field hospital. Captain David Crosley from Massachusetts was severely wounded in the abdomen and losing blood rapidly. His face had taken on a deathly waxy hue. Clara immediately understood. This was a very severe, possibly fatal wound. But something about this man, his courageous face distorted with pain, made her fight for his life with all her strength. She worked on him for more than an hour, stopping internal bleeding, doing everything her knowledge and primitive medical instruments of that era allowed. "Don't give up, Captain," she whispered, cleaning the wound with clean water. "Fight. Do you have someone waiting for you at home?" "My wife," he barely whispered. "Mary and my little daughter, Elizabeth. She's only 2 years old." "You see," Clara smiled at him through her tears. "So you can't give up. Mary and little Elizabeth need you very much." She saved him. Captain Crosley not only survived, but fully recovered. After the war, he would become one of Clara's most ardent supporters, helping her create the American Red Cross. By evening, the roar of cannonade gradually subsided. On the battlefield lay 23,000 Americans, killed and wounded, more than on any other day in the country's history. But Clara continued working by the light of torches and kerosene lanterns. Her assistant, Tommy Wilson, who had been so nervous and frightened in the morning, now worked beside her like an experienced medic. One day of war had turned the boy into a man. "Miss Barton," he said when they took a short break, collapsing to the ground from exhaustion, "how do you endure this? So much blood, so many deaths. How do you find the strength?" Clara looked at the field strewn with bodies, at the dying fires, at the silhouettes of medics with stretchers. Her heart was breaking with pain, but her face remained calm. "Tommy, every time I see a boy, no older than you, dying, I think of his mother. Somewhere far away sits a woman by a window, waiting for a letter from her son. If I can ease his last minutes even a little, if I can write to her that he didn't die alone and forgotten, then all this is not in vain." After Antietam, fame of the angel of the battlefield spread throughout the Union Army. Soldiers passed amazing stories to each other about the tall woman in a dark dress who appeared in the most dangerous places and wasn't afraid of death. The next 2.5 years she spent in constant moves from battle to battle. Fredericksburg in December 1862, Chancellorsville in the spring of 1863, Gettysburg in the summer of 1863. In each battle, Clara lost a piece of her soul, but found new strength in the gratitude of those she managed to help. In May 1864, at the Battle of Spotsylvania, she worked in a field hospital in an old church. There were so many wounded, they were placed on pews, floors, even the altar. Clara worked without sleep for 3 straight days. "Miss Barton, you must rest," Army Surgeon Dr. Dunn told her on the 4th day. "Otherwise we'll lose you too." Clara looked up at him with infinite fatigue in her eyes. "Doctor, if I stop even for a minute, who will hold their hands when they die? Who will say a kind word to them in their last moment?" In June 1864, she was officially appointed head nurse of the Army of the James under General Benjamin Butler's command. This was absolutely unprecedented, a woman in an official military position. But Clara's merits were so obvious that even the most conservative generals didn't dare protest. During the years of war, thousands of wounded soldiers passed through her caring hands, and she remembered each one, his name, his story, his family's address. The war radically changed Clara, transforming the shy girl into a strong, confident woman who understood that her life belonged to all those who suffer. Chapter 5. Search for Lost Souls. On April 9, 1865, in the small town of Appomattox, Virginia, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant. The Civil War, which had claimed more than 620,000 American lives, was finally over. Clara met this news not with joy, but with strange emptiness. For 4 years, she had lived from battle to battle, from wounded to wounded. Now she didn't know how to live in peace. But peace wasn't destined for her. Though the war had ended, human suffering continued. Across the country, thousands of families didn't know what had happened to their sons, husbands, fathers, brothers. Soldiers disappeared without a trace, died in unmarked graves, were hastily buried by comrades during retreats. Every day the postman brought Clara piles of letters. With trembling handwriting, elderly women wrote about their sons. "Dear Miss Barton, I heard from neighbors that you help find missing soldiers. My only son James served in the 5th Infantry Regiment from Maine. I received his last letter in March last year from somewhere in Virginia. Since then, not a word. I beg you, help me learn what happened to him. I'm ready to pay any amount, give everything I have. I just must know the truth, even if it's terrible. Your desperate Sarah Thompson." Clara's heart broke from these letters. Behind every line, she saw living faces, mothers exhausted by sleepless nights, young widows with small children, old people who had lost their only support. She understood their pain because she had seen how these women's sons died. At President Lincoln's request, Clara created the Office of Correspondence with the Friends of the Missing Men of the United States Army. This was a private enterprise that she financed from her own funds and donations from sympathetic people. Clara hired assistants, rented an office in Washington, created a card file of thousands of entries. She wrote letters to surviving regiments, contacted hospitals throughout the country, studied endless lists of prisoners of war. The work was titanic and often seemed hopeless, but sometimes real miracles happened. In June 1865, Clara received a letter from Dorrance Atwater, a former prisoner of the terrible Confederate prison at Andersonville. He wrote that throughout his imprisonment, he had secretly kept a detailed list of all prisoners who died in the prison from disease, starvation, and cruel treatment. Clara immediately went to see him. Atwater turned out to be a young soldier who had miraculously survived the real hell of Andersonville, the most terrible prison for prisoners of war. And all this time, he had risked his life to preserve detailed records of his fellow sufferers. "Miss Barton," he said, handing her a worn notebook, "I knew that someday these records would definitely be needed. Too many mothers will be looking for their boys. They have the right to know the truth." Thanks to this invaluable list, Clara was able to give answers to hundreds of families. The answers were sad, but at least people finally learned the truth instead of agonizing uncertainty. "Dear Mrs. Johnson," she wrote to one of the women, tears dripping onto the paper, "with deep sorrow I inform you that your son, Private Thomas Johnson of the 14th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, died at Andersonville Prison on August 15, 1864. According to records kept by one of the surviving prisoners, your son died of typhus. He was buried in the prison cemetery, grave number 8156. Mr. Atwater told me that Thomas maintained his courage to the end and often spoke of home and of you. Please accept my deepest condolences. Your son served bravely and honestly. With sincere sympathy, Clara Barton. Each such letter cost Clara enormous effort. She cried writing them, imagining what pain these lines would cause. But she knew mothers had a sacred right to know the truth about their children's fate, however bitter that truth might be. The Bureau's work was incredibly exhausting. Clara worked from early morning until late at night, reviewing endless lists, comparing scattered data, maintaining extensive correspondence. In 4 years of intensive activity, the Bureau managed to provide answers about the fate of more than 22,000 people, a huge number for that time. But the most difficult part was the constant emotional burden. Every day Clara dealt with human grief in its most acute and painful manifestations. Letters from inconsolable mothers, from young widows with children in their arms, from old people who had lost their only support in life. One letter particularly shocked her and remained in her memory for a long time. It was written by a 12-year-old girl from a small town in Ohio. Dear Miss Barton, my name is Annie Smith. I am 12 years old. My papa, William Smith, went to war when I was only 8 years old. Mama died 2 years ago from grief and illness. Now I live with Aunt Martha, but she says Papa will never come back, and I need to forget about him. But I can't forget. I believe Papa is alive and will definitely return. He promised to buy me a beautiful doll for Christmas. Please help me find my Papa. I miss him very much. Your hopeful Annie Smith. Clara spent several weeks searching for William Smith. She went through mountains of documents, wrote dozens of letters, and finally found him. He had died at Gettysburg in July 1863, fighting in the ranks of the 82nd Ohio Regiment. Answering little Annie was one of the most agonizing trials in Clara's life. Dear sweet Annie, she wrote, and tears blurred the ink. Your papa was a very brave soldier and a wonderful man. He died defending our country and fighting so all people could be free. Officers told me he often spoke of you and loved you very much. I'm sure he's watching you from heaven now and is proud of what a smart and brave girl you're growing up to be. Take care of yourself, dear, and remember, your papa will always live in your heart. Your Clara Barton. By 1868, Clara was completely exhausted, physically and emotionally. Constant work with human pain and grief, endless letters from grieving families, heavy memories of war, all this had seriously undermined her health. She began having problems with her nervous system, frequent headaches, insomnia. Doctors strongly advised her to completely change her environment and go somewhere far from America, far from all these painful memories. In August 1868, Clara closed her bureau and sailed for Europe. She was 47 years old, and for the first time in many years, she could think only of herself. Chapter 6. Discovery in Geneva. The autumn of 1869 in Geneva was particularly beautiful and peaceful. Yellow and crimson, maple leaves reflected in the calm waters of the lake. Mountains around the city were shrouded in light mist, and the air was filled with the scent of the last roses and the freshness of approaching winter. Clara Barton had come to Switzerland to finally restore her strength after the exhausting years of war and work with missing soldiers. She rented a cozy small apartment with a view of the lake, planning to spend the entire winter here in complete peace and quiet. Clara read books she hadn't had time to read for years, walked the picturesque streets of the old city, enjoyed European culture. For the first time in many years, she could sleep as long as she wanted, eat in a calm atmosphere, not think about others' pain and suffering. But fate didn't give her complete respite even here. On a rainy October day, an elegant gentleman of middle age knocked at her apartment. Dr. Louis Appia, a Swiss physician and one of the founders of a movement Clara had never heard of before. "Madam Barton," he said in perfect English, bowing slightly. "Your fame as the angel of the battlefield has reached Europe too. We have closely followed your remarkable work during the war in America. Allow me to tell you about our organization, which I think you will find very interesting." Dr. Appia told Clara an amazing and inspiring story. In 1859, a young Swiss entrepreneur and philanthropist, Henri Dunant, had become an accidental witness to the bloody Battle of Solferino in northern Italy. Seeing how thousands of wounded soldiers, French, Austrian, Italian, lay without any help on the battlefield, bleeding under the scorching sun, he organized spontaneous assistance, involving local residents. Returning to Switzerland, the shocked Dunant wrote the book A Memory of Solferino, where he proposed creating an international organization to help the wounded during war, regardless of which side they fought for. In 1863, the International Committee for the Relief of the Wounded was created in Geneva, later renamed the International Committee of the Red Cross. "You see, Madam Barton," Dr. Appia explained, showing her various documents, "we do exactly the same thing you did during your Civil War. We help wounded soldiers, regardless of which army they fight for. Our symbol, a red cross on a white background, has become an international sign of neutrality and mercy." Clara listened with bated breath. It turned out she wasn't alone in her noble aspirations. In Europe, there already existed an organization that systematically did exactly what she had intuitively dreamed of all her life, turning mercy into an international system. Dr. Appia showed her the text of the Geneva Convention of 1864, the first international treaty in history that obliged all countries signing it to observe certain humanitarian rules of war, protect the wounded and sick, respect medical personnel, ensure humane treatment of prisoners of war. "This is astounding," Clara said, carefully studying the document. "During our war, we did all this completely instinctively, guided only by the voice of our hearts. But you've created a real international legal system." "Exactly," Dr. Appia was enthusiastic. "And we very much need America's support. Your great country has not yet joined the convention, unfortunately." Clara felt the same old energy that had driven her all her life slowly awakening within her. Could it be that her calling hadn't ended with the war? Could she do even more to alleviate human suffering? When the Franco-Prussian War began in July 1870, Clara, despite doctors' protests, couldn't stay aside. She went to besieged Strasbourg, where she joined the work of the local Red Cross chapter. What she saw there literally shocked her to the core. In one hospital, under one roof, French and German soldiers lay receiving absolutely identical medical care and attention. No one asked which army they fought for, what nationality they were, what religion they professed. Nurses and doctors with red crosses on white armbands worked calmly and confidently. Their neutrality was recognized by both warring sides. "This is a real miracle," Clara told Dr. Zimmermann, the German physician who ran the hospital. "During our Civil War, we also tried to help all wounded without discrimination, but it was our personal decision, our moral choice. But here, this is international law, recognized by all. Yes, Madam Barton, and this is just the beginning. We dream of a time when in any war, in any country in the world, there will be people with red crosses who will bring help and comfort to all sufferers, regardless of politics and nationality. In Strasbourg, Clara met the Grand Duchess of Baden, an elderly aristocrat who personally cared for wounded soldiers in field hospitals. This was a woman who could have spent her time in luxurious palaces, but chose to serve suffering people. Madame Barton, the Grand Duchess told her, as they worked side by side, bandaging wounds, "You simply must create an American branch of the Red Cross. Your country is too large and influential to remain apart from this sacred movement of mercy." Clara worked in Strasbourg for 5 long months until the very end of the war. She experienced firsthand how effectively an international system of aid could work, based on clear legal principles and mutual recognition. For her selfless work, she was awarded the Prussian Iron Cross and the Russian Silver Cross, the rarest honor for a foreigner. But the main reward for Clara was the final understanding of her new life mission. Returning to America in the spring of 1873, full of strength and new ideas, Clara set herself a truly grandiose task: to create an American branch of the Red Cross and achieve the United States' accession to the Geneva Convention. This proved to be immeasurably harder than working under enemy fire on battlefields. Chapter 7. 8 Years of Struggle. America in 1873 categorically did not want to hear about war, international obligations, and preparation for future conflicts. The country was licking its deep wounds after the bloodiest Civil War, building transcontinental railroads, developing the vast expanses of the Wild West, developing industry. Most politicians and ordinary citizens sincerely believed that America would never again participate in large-scale military conflicts. Miss Barton, Senator Charles Sumner, an old friend and ally in the fight against slavery, told her, "People are deadly tired of war. They want to forget it forever, like a terrible nightmare. Why do they need an organization that constantly reminds them of possible new battles and prepares for them?" But Clara was unshakably convinced of the necessity of her mission. She understood wars, unfortunately, are an inevitable part of human history, and humanity must be prepared to maximize the alleviation of their terrible consequences. She began by organizing lectures across the country. Clara spoke to the most diverse audiences: women's clubs, church communities, veterans organizations, college students. Her stories about the Red Cross and the Geneva Convention invariably made a deep impression. "Imagine, dear friends," she said in a packed hall in Boston, "that your son or husband is wounded in war in a distant foreign country. Wouldn't you want to know that there are definitely people there with red crosses on their sleeves who will help him regardless of whether he's a citizen of that country or not?" The audience listened with bated breath. Clara had a rare gift. She could find exactly the words that went straight to the heart, made people feel others' pain as their own. Parallel to lectures, she wrote articles for influential magazines, published brochures, maintained extensive correspondence with politicians and public figures. Slowly, very slowly, public opinion began to turn in her favor. In 1877, an event occurred that unexpectedly helped Clara clearly demonstrate the necessity of an organization like the Red Cross in peacetime. A railroad strike, which began due to wage cuts, turned into serious riots across the country. Large-scale fires broke out in Pittsburgh. Thousands of people were left homeless. Clara immediately organized help for the victims, mobilizing her supporters and volunteers. She clearly demonstrated that an organization like the Red Cross was extremely necessary, not only during wars but also in any large-scale disasters. You see, she convinced skeptical senators, natural disasters, fires, floods, epidemics happen constantly. We vitally need an organization capable of quickly and effectively helping victims. But the most difficult thing was convincing the president. Rutherford B. Hayes, who occupied the White House from 1877, was an extremely cautious politician, not inclined to international adventures and obligations. Clara persistently sought a personal meeting with him for more than a year. Finally, in March 1878, she was received in the famous Oval Office. "Mr. President," she said, carefully laying out documents about Red Cross activities before him, "America simply must join the civilized world. Already 32 countries have signed the Geneva Convention and recognized the principles of international humanitarian law." "Miss Barton," President Hayes replied cautiously, "I certainly understand your noble intentions and deeply respect them. But Congress will never approve international obligations that might drag us into foreign European wars." "But Mr. President," Clara objected hotly, "we're talking exclusively about helping the wounded and sick. This is a matter of elementary humanity, not politics or military alliances." The meeting ended in nothing. President Hayes politely promised to carefully consider the matter, which in diplomatic language meant an almost inevitable refusal. But Clara wouldn't be herself if she gave up after the first failure. She continued her lectures, continued writing and convincing. Gradually, influential allies and supporters appeared. Judge William Lawrence from Massachusetts, Dr. Julian Hubbell, her faithful companion from the battlefield days, several progressively minded congressmen, all became active propagandists for the idea of an American Red Cross. In 1880, a long-awaited breakthrough occurred. James Garfield, elected president, was much more open to international cooperation and progressive ideas. But before Clara could organize a meeting with him, President Garfield was fatally shot by a mentally ill man. Chester Arthur became the new president. Fortunately for Clara, he proved to be an unexpected ally to her cause. On May 21, 1881, after 8 years of persistent and often seemingly hopeless struggle, Clara Barton's dream finally came true. The American Association of the Red Cross was solemnly founded in Washington. Clara was unanimously elected its first president. She was already almost 60 years old, an age when most people of that time thought about rest and quiet old age. But for Clara, this was only the beginning of a completely new and perhaps the most important chapter of her life. "Dear friends and colleagues," she said at the first official meeting of the organization, her voice trembling with emotion, "today we are creating something much greater than just a mutual aid society. We are creating a living bridge between nations, a bright symbol that human compassion and mercy are stronger than any national enmity and political disagreements." In 1882, the United States officially joined the Geneva Convention, becoming a full participant in the International Red Cross movement. America finally became part of the global humanitarian aid system. The first serious test for the newborn organization came with the destructive forest fires in Michigan in the autumn of 1881. The fiery element destroyed several small towns. Thousands of people were left homeless. The American Red Cross sent organized aid to victims for the first time in its history. Clara personally headed this first rescue operation. Despite her venerable age, she worked on equal terms with young volunteers, organized fundraising across the country, coordinated the shipment of clothing and food, created temporary shelters for fire victims. Miss Barton, the grateful mayor of one of the affected towns, told her, "Without your help and Red Cross help, we simply wouldn't have survived this winter. You are our salvation." But the real most serious test came on May 31st, 1889. In the industrial city of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, an old earthen dam burst. A gigantic wall of water, several stories high, rushed at terrifying speed toward the unsuspecting city, sweeping away everything in its path. Clara received a telegram about the disaster late in the evening. By dawn the next day, she was already on a train with a team of experienced doctors and a substantial supply of medicines and supplies. What she saw upon arriving in Johnstown exceeded even the most terrible battlefields of the Civil War in horror. The city had literally disappeared from the face of the earth. Where neat houses and paved streets had been, lay endless mountains of debris, mud, twisted metal, and human bodies. More than 2,000 people died. Entire families were wiped from the face of the earth in minutes. 68-year-old Clara worked in destroyed Johnstown without a break for 6 months. She organized the search for survivors among the rubble, created field hospitals for the wounded, established food and clean water supplies for survivors. It was in Johnstown that Clara's unique organizational talent was fully revealed. From lumber sent as humanitarian aid from distant Iowa, she invented and organized the construction of the famous Red Cross hotels, quickly erected in temporary shelters for thousands of homeless people. "Miss Barton," her assistant Dr. Hubble asked in amazement, "where did you get the design for such a successful construction?" "Doctor," Clara smiled despite her deadly fatigue, "need and despair are the best teachers of inventiveness. We have people who urgently need a roof over their heads, and we have building materials, so we just need to build a house quickly, cheaply, and practically." The construction proved so successful and functional that 6 such hotels were built in Johnstown, housing hundreds of families. And when the acute need for them passed, practical Clara ordered the buildings to be carefully dismantled and all materials transported to the capital. Later, from these boards, soaked with human tears and gratitude, she built her famous house in Glen Echo, Maryland. This house became not only her personal residence, but also the first permanent headquarters of the American Red Cross. Clara introduced the American Amendment to the Red Cross Charter, expanding its activities to include peacetime disaster relief. This revolutionary idea was so successful that in 1884 it was adopted by the entire International Red Cross network. In 1898, when the Spanish-American War began, 77-year-old Clara went to Cuba to help wounded soldiers. This was the first war in which the American Red Cross officially aided American military. For 23 years, Clara continuously headed the organization she had created, transforming it from a small society of enthusiasts into a powerful national structure. Chapter 8: The Sunset of a Legend. Under Clara's wise and energetic leadership, the Red Cross grew and developed rapidly. The organization helped with all major disasters of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The devastating hurricane on the Sea Islands off the South Carolina coast in 1893. The terrible drought in Texas in 1886. The yellow fever epidemic in Florida in 1888. Clara personally participated in most rescue operations, despite her increasingly advanced age. At 70, she worked under the scorching Texas sun. At 72, she was in the disease-ridden swamps of Florida, risking her own life to save epidemic victims. Clara's most important innovation was the famous American Amendment to the International Red Cross Charter. She significantly expanded the organization's scope of activities including systematic aid during natural disasters in peacetime. Human suffering doesn't choose time and place, Clara convincingly argued at international conferences. A hurricane or earthquake can kill as many innocent people as an entire battle. Why should we limit our help only to wartime? But Clara thought not only about American national problems. In 1892, she organized the shipment of 500 railroad cars of flour and cornmeal to starving peasants in distant Russia. In 1896, 75-year-old Clara personally went to the Ottoman Empire to help Armenians who had suffered from mass pogroms. In Constantinople, the elderly American worked in conditions that would have tested even young and healthy people. Unsanitary conditions, tropical diseases, constant political pressure from Turkish authorities. But she didn't give up. Miss Barton, the American ambassador told her with concern, "You're seriously risking your health, and maybe your life. Why do you need all this at your venerable age?" "Mr. Ambassador," Clara replied calmly, "if I don't come here, who will help these unfortunate people? Suffering knows no national boundaries, and therefore mercy shouldn't know them either." For 23 long years, Clara Blessley headed the organization she had created. She transformed a small society of enthusiasts into a powerful national structure with branches in all states of the country. Clara never took a cent of salary for her work with the Red Cross, often spending her own considerable savings on the organization's needs. She was a recognized but quite autocratic leader, personally controlling all aspects of activity. "The Red Cross is my spiritual child," she told critics. "I raised it from nothing and know its needs better than any outsider." But the years were taking their toll. By the beginning of the 20th century, some young members of the board of directors began increasingly criticizing Clara's management methods, considering them hopelessly outdated. The new generation of activists demanded more democracy, collegiality, and modern methods of managing a large organization. In 1900, Congress passed a new charter for the American Red Cross, officially recognizing it as a national organization. This was Clara's greatest triumph, but at the same time the beginning of the end of her sole rule. The new charter required more formal financial reporting, regular independent audits, and collegial adoption of important decisions. Clara, accustomed to acting quickly and unilaterally, had great difficulty adapting to new bureaucratic requirements. The autumn of 1902 brought the first serious clouds to the life of 80-year-old Clara Barton. Critics increasingly and persistently stated that she was too old for effective leadership of such a large and important organization. Young activists, many of whom didn't remember the Civil War and hadn't seen how the Red Cross was created, openly called Clara's methods outdated and ineffective. They demanded radical modernization of management, complete financial transparency, and democratic decision-making procedures. "Miss Barton manages the Red Cross like her private property," the influential Washington Post wrote. "This is completely unacceptable for a modern national organization." Clara painfully and deeply experienced this unfair criticism. The Red Cross wasn't just work or a hobby, it was the work of her entire life, her spiritual child, the fruit of long years of struggle and self-sacrifice. Especially painful was the sharp conflict with Mabel Boardman, a young and ambitious activist from a very influential Washington family, who led the organized opposition to Clara on the board of directors. "Clara," Mabel said coldly to her at one of the tense meetings, "times have radically changed. The Red Cross can no longer be a simple reflection of one personality. however outstanding that personality may be. "Mabel," Clara replied with dignity, "I am not a reflection of the Red Cross. I am its creator and mother. I know its needs and capabilities better than any of you." But the young opponents were persistent and ruthless. They achieved an official investigation of the organization's financial activities under Clara's leadership. The auditors found no violations or abuses. Clara was absolutely honest and selfless in money matters. Moreover, it turned out that she regularly spent her own funds on Red Cross needs. But critics quickly found other grounds for attack. They accused Clara of an authoritarian management style, categorical unwillingness to delegate authority, and stubborn resistance to any modernization. In 1904, moral and political pressure became completely unbearable. At the Red Cross General Assembly, Clara, with a heavy heart, announced her voluntary resignation. "Dear friends and colleagues," she said, standing at the podium in the packed hall, her voice slightly trembling with emotion, "for 23 years, I have had the great honor and happiness to serve you and our sacred mission of mercy. Now the time has come to pass the baton to younger and more energetic hands." The hall met her words with deathly silence. Many of those present were crying, especially those veterans who remembered the heroic first years of the organization, who had worked shoulder to shoulder with Clara in the field. After the assembly, old Dr. Hubble, her faithful friend and assistant from the Johnstown disaster days, approached her. "Clara, this is flagrant injustice. They forgot to whom they owe everything they have." "Julian," Clara replied with a sad but wise smile, "time puts everything in its place. What matters is not whether posterity remembers and thanks us, but whether our work continues, whether the spirit of mercy lives on." Leaving the Red Cross was a painful blow, but Clara didn't give up or fall into despair. In that same year, 1904, at the age of 83, she created a new organization, the National First Aid Association of America. This small organization dealt with teaching ordinary citizens emergency medical care skills, developing standard first aid kits, and spreading knowledge about safety techniques in daily life. "If I can no longer help people during major disasters," Clara philosophically reasoned, "then I'll teach ordinary people to help each other in daily life. Every saved life is priceless." Clara spent the last 8 years of her long life in her amazing house in Glen Echo, Maryland. The 3-story building, constructed from the boards of the famous Johnstown hotels, picturesquely stood among century-old oaks on the banks of the quiet Potomac. The house reflected its owner's unique personality in every way, practical and functional, but at the same time cozy and hospitable. During these quiet years, journalists, historians, writers, and simply curious people often visited Clara. She was quite reluctant to talk about herself and her achievements, but with sincere pleasure told about those she had managed to save, about soldiers she had nursed, about families she had helped reunite after the war. "You understand," she would say, settled comfortably in her favorite chair by the fireplace. "I was just an instrument in the hands of Providence. The real heroes are those boys who died in my arms, but found the strength to smile through pain and thank me for care." Clara slowly worked on her memoirs, but the work progressed with great difficulty. Too many heavy memories, too much experienced pain. She maintained active correspondence with Civil War veterans, families of fallen soldiers, and Red Cross employees around the world. To one young doctor who was just beginning to work with the Red Cross, she wrote, "Dear doctor, always remember, we don't just treat diseases and wounds, we treat living people." Behind every suffering stands a human story. Behind every pain, someone's boundless love. Be infinitely gentle with those who have entrusted you with their pain and hope. Despite her advanced age, Clara remained amazingly active and energetic almost until her final days. At 88, she still gave public lectures to young medics. At 89, she personally organized help for flood victims in the neighboring county. In the winter of 1912, her health sharply and noticeably deteriorated. Old wounds received during the war made themselves known with constant pain. Her lungs, seriously undermined by long years of work in unsanitary conditions and smoky hospitals, were failing. On April 12, 1912, exactly 51 years after the beginning of the Civil War, Clara Barton quietly and peacefully died in her house, surrounded by close friends. She was 90 years old. She had far exceeded the average life expectancy of women of that time, which was only 56 years. Hundreds of people gathered at her funeral in her native Oxford, Massachusetts. Gray-haired Civil War veterans, already very old and frail, proudly carried the coffin of their angel of the battlefield. Red Cross representatives came from all over America and many European countries. Ordinary citizens whom she had once helped in difficult times cried, remembering her kindness and selflessness. Reverend Samuel May, who conducted the solemn service, said in his sermon, "Clara Barton lived not one life, but thousands of lives, the lives of all those people whom she saved, comforted, and inspired by her example. Her physical death is not an end, but a transition to true immortality." Epilogue. The Legacy of Mercy. Today, more than a century after Clara Barton's death, her spiritual legacy continues to live and act in every manifestation of human mercy, in every extended helping hand, in every person who consciously chooses compassion over indifference. The American Red Cross, created by her tireless hands and iron will, has become one of the largest and most influential humanitarian organizations in the world. Every 8 minutes, somewhere in America, someone from the organization's staff or volunteers responds to another emergency. The Red Cross provides 40% of all donor blood in the United States, annually trains millions of Americans in vital first aid skills, and provides constant support to military personnel and their families. During the devastating Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the Haiti earthquake in 2010, and the global COVID-19 pandemic, everywhere volunteers with Red Crosses on their sleeves selflessly continue the great work begun by one determined woman a century and a half ago. In her house in Glen Echo today stands a museum, the first National Historic Monument in American history, specifically dedicated to a woman's achievements and legacy. Thousands of visitors annually can see her working office where she led the Red Cross for a quarter century, the bedroom where she wrote countless letters to families of fallen soldiers, and the warehouses where strategic supplies for disaster relief were stored. On her writing desk under glass lies the last letter she wrote to a young nurse working in an army hospital. "Dear Elizabeth, always remember, in your hands are not just medical instruments, but people's living hope. Every time you ease someone's pain, you make our world a little kinder and more humane." But the true memory of Clara lives not only in museums, monuments, and official ceremonies. It lives in the very spirit of mutual aid and solidarity that she helped cultivate in American society. When a natural or man-made disaster occurs, thousands of ordinary people immediately rush to help victims, often risking their own safety. This, too, is part of Clara Barton's great legacy. Clara radically changed society's conception of women's role and capabilities in the modern world. In a historical era when women didn't even have the right to vote, she created an influential national organization and successfully led it for 23 years. She convincingly proved that a woman could be an outstanding leader, a talented organizer, and a fearless pioneer. Her remarkable life is an inspiring lesson about the true power of human compassion. It began with an 11-year-old girl patiently caring for her seriously ill brother, and ended with the creation of an internationally recognized humanitarian aid system. Clara Barton was not a saint or an angel in the literal sense. She was an ordinary woman with her human weaknesses, shortcomings, and contradictions. She could be stubborn, domineering, and intolerant of criticism and objections. But she had one priceless quality that more than compensated for all her flaws: an innate ability to see others suffering and physically be unable to pass by it. "You must never think of anything except the need and how to meet it," she said. These simple words became the motto and guiding principle of her entire long life, as well as of all those who continue her noble work today. In our complex time, when the world is again full of wars and disasters, when millions of people suffer from disease, hunger, and natural calamities, Clara Barton's spirit and precepts acquire special relevance and significance. Every time someone donates blood to save a stranger, every time a volunteer spends their free time helping those in need, every time an ordinary person performs a simple act of mercy, in this lives and acts the immortal legacy of the woman who brought organized mercy to America. Clara Barton was born in a small provincial town in the era of candles and horse-drawn carriages. She died in a world of automobiles, electricity, and emerging aviation. During her exceptionally long life, she witnessed how America transformed from a predominantly agricultural country into a world industrial power. But the main change she witnessed and helped create was a profound transformation in human hearts and social consciousness. The idea that civilized society must systematically care for its weak and suffering, that helping victims is not just charity, but a moral obligation, that true mercy knows no national boundaries. All these revolutionary ideas became an integral part of American and world consciousness only thanks to her titanic efforts. Her amazing life is a vivid reminder that one person, armed with a clear purpose and unshakable determination, can indeed radically change the world for the better. For this, one doesn't need to be an influential politician or a wealthy millionaire. It's enough to have an open heart, see genuine need, and find the courage to extend a helping hand. Clara Barton, Angel on the Battlefield, founder of the American Red Cross. The woman who proved by her own example that human compassion is immeasurably stronger than any fear, and that true love for one's neighbor can conquer death itself. Her priceless legacy lives and will live forever, as long as there are people in the world ready to help the suffering, as long as the sacred fire of mercy burns in human hearts. Real angels don't die. They become an inexhaustible source of inspiration for all those who follow in their footsteps of serving people.